It's good to be with everyone this evening. We're going to talk about the first book that I wrote, the story of the Battle of Palmetto Ranch. It's the last land action of the war between the states, fought on the banks of the Rio Grande east of Brownsville, Texas on May 12th and 13th of 1865. And it's a battle that most people have heard of, but a lot of people don't know much about. It was a battle that was very quickly shrouded in controversy and mythology. And my introduction to the Battle of Palmetto Ranch it came when I was very young, and my mother bought me one of the old historical comic books, Classics Illustrated Special Issue on the War Between the States. It had been published in 1961 for 35 cents. And as a kid, of course, I was absolutely enamored of it. But on the very last page of that comic book, there was this image right here that for some reason grabbed hold of me and stuck with me. And it mentions that in May of 1865, the last battle of the Civil War was fought at a place called Palmetto Hill on the banks of the Rio Grande. And that's basically all that it said. You can infer from the picture that the comic book was implying that there was a very bloody battle. There were a lot of dead men laying over the field when it was over. For some reason, that picture stuck with me. And when I got to college, I was taking a class in English rhetoric, and one of the assignments that we had was to write a paper, a research paper, and my professor was actually a frustrated historian, and so I guess he decided if he was going to have to read all these freshman English papers, he might as well read about history. And so he told us that we had to do original research. So we walked across campus to what was then the Barker, Texas History Center. And it occurred to me that, hey, remember that Battle of Palmetto Ranch thing from the comic book? I'd always wondered more about that battle. Let me see if I can dig up anything about what happened there. And lo and behold, I stumbled into something pretty significant that would very much change the story of the Battle of Palmetto Ranch. It was understood, and that sent me off on a long trail of research that finally wound up in a book that was published by my alma mater, the University of Texas Press, in 2002. So some background to this battle, of course. Texas was one of the original 7 states to secede from the Union. It was the only Confederate state at the end of the war that basically remained unconquered. There were no Federals to speak of on Texas soil. It was one of only 2 Confederate state capitals that were not captured by the Federals, Austin and Tallahassee being the 2. And Texas was also a source of men and material for the Confederacy throughout the war, even though Texas at that point really was not terribly well developed. In fact, the frontier line that kind of ran down here from where that X is up to the Red River, down to the Rio Grande, kind of cutting a line through San Antonio and Fredericksburg. All of this part of Texas was still under the sway of the Indians, primarily the Comanche Indians. There wasn't much of the way of industry in Texas. It was pretty much an agricultural state, but they grew a lot of cotton there. But the thing that made Texas particularly interesting to the Lincoln administration throughout the Civil War was the fact that it was the only Confederate state that shared an international boundary. And that boundary, of course, was with Mexico, with the Rio Grande River being the physical boundary itself. And this was very worrisome to the federal government because Mexico, as a neutral power, was exempt from the federal blockade. So the Federals could blockade the whole coast of the Southern Confederacy, but they could not blockade Mexico, nor could they blockade the mouth of the Rio Grande, which, under the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which had ended the Mexican War, was a neutral waterway, and neither Mexico or the United States was allowed to blockade it for a mile north or south of its exit into the Gulf of Mexico. And this connection between the Confederacy and Mexico through Texas became even more problematic for the Federals when the French government intervened in Mexico in 1862 and then a year or so later set up a viceroyalty under the Archduke Maximilian. The French, of course, were very pro-Confederate, and as the Lincoln administration looked at Texas, this this international border, looked like an end run around the federal blockade. The Confederates could ship cotton across the Rio Grande, take it down to the Matamoros, and then to the little port of Baghdad on the coast, put that cotton on European ships that were immune to the federal blockade, send it to Europe, bring back war material that then could be sent across Rio Grande into Texas, and potentially a means to not only supply the Confederacy writ large, but also a means for the Confederacy writ large to pay for its war effort. The Federals naturally blockaded Texas, but throughout the war, they were always looking at a way to stop that trade. They did not know that that trade was largely ineffective. It did something to help support the Trans-Mississippi Confederacy, especially the Confederates in Texas. But civil war would break out in Mexico. That would close the border for most of a year. The distances from the cotton fields to the Rio Grande were very long. Travel was very difficult. This was never really the end run around the blockade that the United States government feared that it would be. But nonetheless, if you were worried about the French and Mexico eventually making common cause with the Confederacy and sending a French army to help fight the Confederates, then the Rio Grande border was something that was bound to give you nightmares. There was a great deal of fighting around Texas during the Civil War. Of course, Sibley launched his invasion of New Mexico and Colorado from Texas. And basically, every year of the war, starting in 1863 through the end of the conflict, saw the Federals try and get into Texas. So in October of 1862, the Federals had seized Galveston, which was the principal port of Texas. But on New Year's Eve of 1863, Confederate land and naval forces under John Magruder had won a spectacular victory that evicted the Federals from Galveston. In September of 1863, the Federals tried again to come up the Sabine River to get into Texas, to cut it off from Louisiana. They grabbed control of the railroad that would lead them down into Houston, but they were stopped at the Battle of Sabine Pass and forced to retreat. In 1864, you have Banks' Red River Campaign and Steele's Arkansas expedition. They're going to try and drive into Texas. Both of those are naturally going to be repulsed by the Confederates at the battles of Mansfield and Pleasant Hill, the Battle of Jenkins Ferry up in Arkansas. But the greatest federal success on getting into Texas, although it was a temporary one, came in November of 1863, when a federal expedition under the command of Major General Nathaniel Banks had invaded the Texas coast, south of Galveston, which would be up here. They had landed in the Enola, which at that time was a significant port on the coast. It's subsequently wiped out by hurricane, and that ends its story. But from Indianola south, they grabbed control of the barrier islands off Texas. An attempt to get Corpus Christi was blocked, but the Federals did land at the southern tip of Texas on Brazos Island, which is just above the mouth of the Rio Grande. This had been a staging area for the American Army during the Mexican-American War. The battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma had been fought not very far from that point. And then Banks had sent a small force up the Rio Grande toward the city of Laredo. And at Laredo, he was met by Confederate troops under Colonel Santos Benavides, and he was defeated and driven back down the river, at which point another Confederate force hastily assembled and under the command of Colonel John S. Rip Ford, a famous Texas Ranger from before the war, a newspaperman, a politician, a statesman, a real Texan's Texan, had led a force of about 1,200 troopers that he called the Cavalry of the West from Austin down to the Rio Grande. And by July of 1864, they had pushed the Federals all the way off the Texas mainland back to that little spit of sand known as Brazos Island. And so at that point, that was all that was left of the Union Army in Texas, although federal concerns about Texas and the French/Mexico connection, of course, remained very, very vivid. The area now that becomes critical in understanding what's going to happen is the space between Brownsville, Texas, and Brazos Island. Along the Rio Grande here, just outside of Brownsville is Fort Brown, which had been built during the Mexican War. It was the principal military establishment here. It had been surrendered when Texas seceded, and now it is occupied by the Confederates. So this is your primary theater of war, and sort of right in the middle of that space is the future battlefield of Palmetto Ranch. Brownsville was the jewel for anybody interested in military control of the Rio Grande. Brownsville was a fairly significant sized city just across the river from a similar sized Mexican city called Matamoros. And it was here through a very primitive ferry system that goods were transferred back and forth between Texas and Mexico. And a lot of the goods coming out of Texas, of course, were cotton, and the goods going back tended to be clothing, dry goods, foodstuffs, some arms and ammunition, but really not a lot of military material in the strictest sense, because Mexico, being in the throes of civil war between the French forces under Maximilian and the anti-French forces under Benito Juarez, needed all the arms and munitions that they could get a hold of. Nonetheless, this was the centerpiece of Confederate economic activity on the banks of the Rio Grande, and therefore it would be the target, the initial target at least, of any Union force that might venture off Brazos Island and head inland along the banks of the Rio Grande. The federal forces on Brazos Island were fairly significant for the size of the place. It's not a very big island. It's not very hospitable. It's a great big heap of sand. There's not much in the way of foliage there. No real trees for shade, lots of underbrush, and exposed to the Gulf of Mexico and the weather. It was kind of an unhealthy place. The Federals had built fortifications on the northern end of the island at a place called Brazos Santiago, which also had the wharves that constituted the lifeline of the federal forces here back to New Orleans, which was their principal source of supply. The Federals had also built some fortifications and mounted heavy guns at the southern end of the island at a place called Boca Chica Pass. And this is a very shallow pass leading from the Gulf of Mexico into the inland waterway of the Laguna Madre, which separates the Texas mainland from the barrier islands. And in the right kind of weather conditions, you can actually ford Boca Chica Pass over sandbars. But from the northern end of the island, it would take a ship to get you to the mainland. In the spring of 1865, the Federals had 4 regiments of infantry at Brazos Santiago, the 62nd United States Colored Troops, the 87th and 46th USCT. None of them had seen combat. They were unblooded. The 34th Indiana Veteran Volunteer Infantry, however, had seen a lot of action and was the only veteran regiment on Brazos Island. And then you had the 2nd Texas Cavalry US, which was actually still forming. There were only a couple of companies. They didn't have any horses whatsoever. You had some heavy artillery batteries and a blockader of the USS Isabel, which tended to hang around the island in the off chance that there might be a need for her guns, or she might run across a Confederate blockade runner. The situation in Texas, of course, in the spring of 1865 was of great interest to the Lincoln administration. They had never gotten over this fear of the French and the Confederates making a common cause. All the federal attempts to get into Texas, of course, had been repulsed, but there was now even more of an emphasis being placed on what might happen in Texas, because it was becoming apparent that the war east of the Mississippi was going to be coming to an end very soon. The Army of Northern Virginia was spending its last days in the trenches of Petersburg. Hood's army had already been smashed at Franklin and Nashville. Sherman had marched through Georgia to the sea and now was going up through the Carolinas. Confederate resistance east of the Great River looked like it was on its last legs, but there was enormous concern that the rebels might make a last-ditch stand in the Trans-Mississippi region, and that if Jeff Davis could get there and keep the Confederate government going, and potentially ally himself with the French, the United States would have another round of civil war to go, and a very difficult round of civil war to try and finish off. And that's where Major General Lew Wallace comes into the story. Wallace, of course, had been a Union division commander at Shiloh. He'd earned Grant's disfavor there, had been shuffled off to basically administrative posts. But then in July of 1864, he had commanded the scratch federal force at the Battle of Monocacy, that although they lost that fight, they stalled Jubal Early's corps for a whole day, and by doing that saved Washington from capture, giving Sedgwick's Sixth Corps just enough time to come up from the trenches of Petersburg to man the federal capital's defenses. So Wallace is back in the good graces of the administration and General Grant because of this. And in the early spring of 1865, he gets a letter from an old school buddy who has just come back to New Orleans from Texas. And his buddy writes him to report that there is a lot of disaffection in Texas, that the Texans are not happy. They're very glum. They don't see any way for the Confederacy to win the war. They're very worried about what might happen once the war is lost, what will happen to their property, what will happen to their rights, what will happen to their slaves. And the chum of Wallace basically suggests that if the federal government made overtures to the rebels in Texas, they would be willing to abandon the Confederacy, join an alliance with the United States to face down the French in Mexico, and especially if they thought that this might keep the worst of post-war retribution falling on their heads, they would be willing to abandon the Confederate cause and take up the side of the Union in a fight to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. So Wallace, getting this letter, gets a hold of Grant, and he says, this all seems very plausible to me. My school friend is very reliable, and I would like permission to go to Texas to check this out. And Grant, who's a very pragmatic man, probably doesn't think there's much to it. But nonetheless, he and the Lincoln administration say, well, why not? It's only going to cost us the services of Lew Wallace for a handful of weeks. Even if nothing comes out of it, we've really lost nothing. And on the off chance that Wallace's friend knows what he's talking about, and the Confederates in Texas are willing to switch sides, then this will be an effort well spent. So Wallace gets permission to go down to the Rio Grande, go to Brazos Santiago, get a hold of the Confederates on the mainland, and see if they might be willing to change sides. And so he travels down to Texas. He gets there in early March of 1865, and he sends a message inland to Brigadier General James Slaughter, who's in command of all Confederate forces along the Rio Grande in southeast Texas. And he tells them, I have come from Washington to discuss with you certain pragmatic matters such as the retention of criminals and bandits. What do we do if we catch somebody that Texas wants arrested? What do the Texans do if they catch somebody that the United States government wants arrested? Wallace doesn't say what he's really after. So he makes it sound like this is really bland stuff. And would Slaughter be willing to come to Brazos Santiago and meet him? And Slaughter says he's amenable to that. He takes Rip Ford, who is under his command and in charge of the Confederate forces between Brownsville and the Rio Grande. And the three men get together at Brazos Santiago on March 9th. They get along with each other very well. There's a nice dinner. The Federals are a great host. But eventually, Wallace puts all of his cards on the table, and he wants to know, will Texas abandon the Confederacy, make a separate peace with the United States in order to face down the French in Mexico? Ford and Slaughter, Wallace believes, are intrigued by the idea, whether that's true or not. They did tell him, hey, look, we don't get to decide those kinds of things. We're far, far lower on the chain of command than the people who will make those kind of decisions. But we will send your proposals to the commander of the state of Texas, which was Major General John Walker, who had seen a lot of service in the Eastern Theater. He'd been part of the Army of Northern Virginia during the Peninsula Campaign. He had fought at Sharpsburg and then been sent west to take command of a division of Texas troops who had become famous as Walker's Greyhounds. They had fought in several of the major Confederate victories in 1864. And now he's the commander of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, headquartered in Houston. And when Walker receives the proposals from Slaughter and Ford, he is furious. This is the blackest treason to the Confederacy that is being suggested here. He chides Slaughter and Ford for having sent these forward. He says, look, it's natural since the Federals were lying that you went and met Wallace. But the fact that he had to come to the remotest corner of the Confederacy to give these kind of terms to you indicates that nothing he's doing is above board. And he is not even going to forward this to Lieutenant General, or rather General Kirby Smith, who is in command of the entire Trans-Mississippi Department. So the whole proposal ends here, except for one important caveat, and that is that when Slaughter, Ford, and Wallace had left each other's company, they had agreed to a truce on the banks of the Rio Grande. It was like, look, nobody is going to win or lose the war on the Rio Grande River. And there's no point in men suffering and dying here when the big decisions about victory or defeat are going to be made east of the Mississippi River. And so there had been an informal truce. And when Walker sent back his refusal to even forward the proposals that Wallace made up the chain of command, the Federals under Wallace believed, well, that's it, the truce is off. However, Slaughter and Ford, holding to the logic that there's no need to have any fighting in the Rio Grande, believed that the truce was still in place. And of course, that's going to play a little bit of a role in what's going to happen going forward. So for the Federals, the war is still going on. And of course, the Confederates are still in place on the Rio Grande. Everything in Texas is sort of in a state of suspended animation. The Confederate forces under Walker and Kirby Smith are preparing for a big Federal invasion. They know that Galveston is vulnerable. It can't be held, so they're going to retreat inland and establish a fortified line between Liberty and Richmond, Texas, between which runs a railroad. This is about 50 miles or so south of Houston, and they will fortify Houston, and the Federals come ashore at Galveston. They'll have to fight their way to Houston and then take it under siege, which the Confederates in Texas, of course, are counting on the Federals not being able to do. So there's a lot of preparation for what might happen in Texas, but all eyes are on what's going on east of the Mississippi River. And of course, what is happening east of the Mississippi River are the death blows to the Southern Confederacy. So Richmond and Petersburg fall. Lee is forced to surrender at Appomattox. Mobile, Alabama is captured by the Federals. Joe Johnston is driven into North Carolina, and he opens negotiations with Sherman. Of course, in the midst of all of this, Lincoln is assassinated. Andrew Johnson becomes president of the United States and begins to talk very tough about how the Union is going to end the war and how it's going to deal with traitors and rebels and that sort of thing. And the question, of course, is how much of this did the Confederates west of the Mississippi River, and particularly how much of this did the Confederates in Texas along the banks of the Rio Grande know? And the story that had always circulated about the Battle of Palmetto Ranch is that the Confederates who fought that battle knew nothing of these events. They had no idea what had happened east of the Mississippi River, and it was from captured federal prisoners after the battle that they learned all of this. And the great discovery that I made when I walked over to the Barker, Texas History Center to write that English paper was that this was not true. Not true in the least, because one of the things I found in that archives was a letter written by Lieutenant George Lee Robertson, who was from Austin, Texas. He had enlisted in the 4th Texas Infantry at the start of the war. He'd been part of Hood's Texas Brigade, fighting in the Eastern Theater, badly wounded and captured at Sharpsburg in September 1862. Had been paroled, granted medical leave to come back home to recuperate in Austin. But by the time he was well, the Federals had seized control of the Mississippi River, and he could not get back to his unit in Virginia. And so when the call went out for people to join Rip Ford in July of 64 to drive the Federals out of the Rio Grande Valley, Robertson was one of the men who, stepped forward and volunteered, and he was still on the banks of the Rio Grande in May of 1865. And while he was based at a place called Palmetto Ranch, right on the banks of the river, on the morning of May 8th, 1865, a steamboat from the King and Kennedy line, which operated out of Brownsville but under the flag of neutral Mexico, came steaming upriver. And as it passed the Confederate camp at Palmetto Ranch, the people on board the steamboat threw the latest New Orleans Times-Picayune paper to the rebel soldiers. And fortunately, in the letter that he's going to write after reading this particular journal, Lieutenant Robertson is very specific about the name of the paper and the date of the edition of the paper that he reads. So it was very easy to go and look up this paper and to see what the news was that had reached the Confederates on the Rio Grande. This news, by the way, had gotten to the big cities, Austin, Houston, San Antonio, several days earlier. But now there's no doubt that the Confederates who were going to fight the Battle of Palmetto Ranch know what has happened east of the Great River. And this is just the above the fold stuff here. So you can see that they're talking about the surrender of Johnson, Lee's army making its melancholy departure for home, that Jeff Davis is on the run and trying to get to the Mississippi. They talk about Booth the assassin. In other words, here is the full record of disaster that has befallen the Confederacy east of the Mississippi River. And it's pretty grim reading for any diehard Confederate. And it leads Robertson to write his sister that same day on May 8th, 1865. And he lays out, hey, this is what we've just heard. And this is the way that the new president, Andrew Johnson, is talking. And it looks like bad news for those of us who have been fighting for the Confederacy. And he concludes the letter with this. He says, there is nothing left to us but to fight. We will show them that we are not subjugated should our armies be disbanded. To hold the South in subjugation will require a standing army of 1,000,000 men, and even then there will not be peace in the country. There are at least 130,000 to 200,000 true men in the South who, rather than be a slave, would pour out their heart's blood upon the soil for which they have fought so long and so nobly. Can a force of that number of determined men be subjugated? Not while they live. I have a good horse, 6-shooter, and an old Enfield rifle which I have sworn into the Confederate service for 25 years. Well, sis, I've written more on the war question than I intended to, but as you all know, it interests me more than anything else. If I can't have a Confederacy, I don't want anything else. And so, not only is Robertson telling us that the Confederates in southern Texas know about the disasters east of the river, he's also telling us that at least a significant portion of those men don't care. They're determined, at least for the moment, to continue the struggle for Southern independence. Now, not all of them. About half of the Confederate forces in southeastern Texas, when they got this news, acknowledged that the Southern effort had failed, and they went home. They said, "It's over. I'm not staying around to become a prisoner. I'm staying around to fight a battle. I'm going to go home." But the other half of Slaughter and Ford's forces remained in the field, and they were still willing to fight if there was a chance to fight. But with a truce in place, what were the odds that there would be a battle before at least a major federal invasion of Texas, which was already in the works, might take place? Well, the person who's going to decide whether or not there's going to be one last battle in Texas before that invasion is Colonel Theodore Barrett. He's a New Yorker by birth, but he'd entered the service through Minnesota. He'd been a captain, seen no service to speak of against Confederates, although he had fought against the Sioux Uprising in 1862. But he was a big believer in emancipation, and he'd accepted a commission as colonel of the 1st Missouri Colored Infantry, which ultimately becomes the 62nd United States Colored Infantry. And in April, the end of April of 1865, he assumed command of the federal forces at Brazos Santiago from the previous commander, Colonel Jones, who had led the 34th Indiana. And Jones had written to his superiors in New Orleans and told them, "Look, I could march to Brownsville and take the place at any moment, but I wouldn't be able to stay there. And I'm not sure if you approve of the temporary occupation of Brownsville or not." And the word had come back from New Orleans, "No, we don't approve of the temporary occupation of Brownsville. Stay where you are. Don't go on to the mainland until we're ready to do something really significant." Well, those had been Jones' orders. But now Barrett is in charge, and Barrett does not necessarily consider himself bound by those orders, nor does he consider himself bound by the truce that had been negotiated at the beginning of March between Wallace, Slaughter, and Ford. The truce that Wallace had said was off, but the Confederates still believed was on. So if anybody's going to do anything that's going to instigate a fight, it's going to be Colonel Barrett. And Barrett is going to do that something that's going to bring on the last battle of the Civil War. So, what he plans to do is to send an expedition onto the mainland. On May 11th, 1865, he's going to assemble 8 companies from his own regiment, the 62nd United States Colored Troops, about 250 men, and he's going to put them on a steamboat along with 2 companies of the still forming 2nd Texas Cavalry US, about 50 men dismounted. He's going to put them on a steamboat at Brazos Santiago. They're going to cross the Laguna Madre to Point Isabel, and then they're going to march inland for a purpose that Barrett never actually explains, not then and not after the war. In fact, there are going to be several kind of excuses that will be made, but why this expedition is being sent to the mainland is never made really clear. It is on the surface a foraging expedition, to round up cattle. That would provide fresh meat for the troops on Brazos Santiago. Maybe you might capture some horses for the 2nd Texas Cavalry, which is still dismounted. But Barrett's purpose is never adequately explained. The expedition is not launched as planned. The steamer breaks down, and so the crossing point is switched to the southern end of Brazos Island, where the Federals, instead of taking a boat to Point Isabel, are now going to go across the Boca Chica Pass. They're going to go in small boats. The few wagons and ambulances they're going to go with them will ford the pass, and they will go on to the mainland. Again, the reason that they're going to the mainland is not spelled out. Um, there is, however, no doubt that the Federals were coming onto Texas soil with hostile intent, because the first thing that they're supposed to do is they're supposed to surround and capture a Confederate outpost that is rumored to be at a place called White's Ranch. The commander of this expedition is Lieutenant Colonel David Branson, who is the second command of the 62nd USCT, but with Barrett in charge of all of Brazos Santiago. He's the guy who's leading the regiment. And so on the night of May 11th, 12th, these federal forces, 300 of them, all afoot with a few supply wagons and ambulances, no artillery, march toward White's Ranch. It's an all night long march. They surround it and at dawn move in on it, only to find that the Confederates who had been there had left. They were gone. There was nobody to capture. So at that point, Branson marches his forces up the river toward Palmetto Ranch, where they run into a body of Confederates, about 60 Confederate cavalry, and a skirmish begins. And this turns out to be the first day of what will be called in the history books the Battle of Palmetto Ranch. The fighting is rather inconclusive. It's a heavy skirmish. There are virtually no casualties, although there are a few men who are wounded. And it's a difficult place to fight. This is what the battlefield looks like. It's pool table flat. There's no real high ground anywhere around that amounts to much. Palmetto Hill itself is only about 15 feet high, and all of this is covered with a dense chaparral. And so you've got mesquite and yucca plants and thorns, and about everything out here will scratch you, stick you, or bite you. It's a very, very nasty place to be an infantryman. And it's across this flat terrain that Branson's foot soldiers are skirmishing with Confederate cavalry to no real purpose. The fighting, of course, is something that tends to, the Confederates are going to believe, violates the truce that had been established. That's not going to set well with General Slaughter. It's really not going to set well with Rip Ford. But as the fighting goes on, Captain William Robinson, who is in command of the 60 or so men who are skirmishing with Branson, sends word back to Fort Brown outside Brownsville, saying that at noon he found 300 Federals occupying Palmetto Ranch. The skirmish had started, and as the dusk fell, the Federals were pulling back to White's Ranch because Branson did not have orders to go to Brownsville. He did not even really have orders to do much of anything. And so his purpose is vague and unclear. It's obvious that he's not going to be capturing any horses. He's not going to be capturing any cattle. And so I'll go back to White's Ranch and spend the night within safe marching distance of Brazos Island. But he sends word back to General Barrett. I moved inland at Palmetto Ranch. I ran into the Confederates. They were willing to fight. We had a skirmish. Now I pulled back to White's Ranch, and I am awaiting your orders. And so both commanders who have been fighting on the 12th have sent word to the rear and basically said, look, we think that this is probably over, but what do you want us to do? Well, Colonel Ford knows exactly what he wants Lieutenant Robinson to do. He wants him to stay close to the Yankees and to hold on. He tells them that I am going to gather a force and I am going to come out and I am going to reinforce you. So Ford is going to send riders into the night to call in his cavalry and his artillery horses, all of which have been widely scattered to facilitate foraging them. It's going to take most of the night for these forces to concentrate at Fort Brown. And once he's got them there, he intends to march toward Palmetto Ranch to reinforce Robinson and to deal with the enemy if he is still on the Texas mainland, where he's not supposed to be. There's supposed to be a truce. and the Federals have violated it. And that is not the sort of thing that a man like Rip Ford is going to allow to stand. If the Federals are still there when he arrives, he is willing to do combat. It turns out that he's going to be willing to do combat with a relatively weak force. His cavalry of the West at this point has atrophied badly after the news of the Eastern Theater disasters had swept through the Rio Grande Valley. He's got 3 battalions of cavalry, no infantry whatsoever. Robinson's battalion, which once all of its forces are gathered together, will have 180 men. Then he's got another battalion under Captain D.M. Wilson, 90 men, and a 3rd battalion under Captain Carrington of 120 men. So he's got roughly speaking, 400 men. But he's also going to have something that the Federals don't have, and that is the 3rd Texas Field Battery, a battery of artillery. It's kind of a hodgepodge battery. It's 6 guns, though, howitzer, a rifled gun, and then some smoothbores, about 60 men. But this is going to give Ford a punch that the Federals do not have. That is, if the Federals are still waiting around on the Texas mainland for Rip Ford's force to engage them. Well, it turns out that that's exactly what the Federals are going to do. Barrett, when he got Branson's message saying that they've been fighting at Palmetto Ranch, did not, as Branson anticipated, order the expedition to fall back to Brazos Island. Instead, he sent out a relief force under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Morrison, who's in charge of the 34th Indiana Infantry. The 34th Indiana is going to send 9 companies to reinforce the 62nd and those 2 companies of dismounted Texas Unionists. The 34th had seen plenty of service in Brandt's Vicksburg campaign, so this was a veteran regiment that had reenlisted and therefore had earned the name of Veteran Volunteer Infantry. And when they did that, they had developed a new uniform, which was a faux Zouave jacket. Now, this is your standard shell jacket to which trim has been applied to make it look like a Zouave jacket. So a rather kind of distinctive uniform for these Hoosiers who are marching onto the Texas mainland. Not only are the 34th Indiana veterans coming to reinforce Branson, but Colonel Barrett is coming himself. He's going to take personal command of the expedition. And so on the morning of May 13th, the reinforcements under Morrison arrive at White's Ranch. Barrett, taking command of the whole, moves his force back upriver and runs into Captain Robinson around Palmetto Ranch again. And the skirmish that had been fought yesterday is now renewed for a second day. And the Confederate cavalry, of course, badly outnumbered, 60 men versus now 500 Federal infantry, is using its mobility to basically stay out of their way. The Federals seize Palmetto Ranch, and then they move down onto Palmetto Hill, which is down in this bend in the river. And having taken control of all this, the Federals now have to decide what they're going to do. And Colonel Barrett, with Colonel Morrison and Colonel Branson in tow, rides up to Palmetto Hill, where he finds a company of the 34th Indiana under the command of Second Lieutenant Charles Jones, who had led skirmishers to take Palmetto Hill. And seeing Lieutenant Jones, Barrett rides over to him with 3 field officers in tow, tells him he's done a great job, and now asks him, well, what do you think can be done? And Second Lieutenant Jones, of course, knowing that there's a big gulf between second lieutenants and colonels, says, well, whatever you want to be done, sir, just give us your orders. But Barrett insists, even though he's got 3 field officers right there with him, he doesn't ask them what they think should be done. He asks Second Lieutenant Jones what should be done. He says, no, I want to hear from you, Lieutenant. What do you think should be done? What do you think we can do? And Jones at this point says, well, if you're going to ask me, I'm going to answer you. And he suggests a maneuver. He suggests that he take his company and move it through the chaparral along the banks of the Rio Grande in a flanking maneuver to try and get behind the Confederate cavalry. And if the rest of the Federal force will maneuver in the open plain and from Palmetto Hill and draw the Confederates' attention, he will take his company and one other, and he will get behind the Confederates, and then at the right moment, he will come dashing out of the chaparral, and the Confederate cavalry will be caught between two forces, and it might be destroyed, or at least it will be damaged heavily. And Barrett listens to that and he says, you know what? I like that. This is what we're going to do. So he tells Jones to go ahead. And so the lieutenant takes his company and another when he begins to snake along the chaparral by the river. And he's just about to get into position when, to his amazement, here comes the entire 62nd USCT marching toward him. And under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Branson, who comes up to Jones and says, I've been sent here to reinforce you. So here's a colonel commanding a regiment who's reporting to a second lieutenant in charge of two companies saying, I've been sent to reinforce you and to follow your orders. And of course, Jones is completely flabbergasted by this. This is kind of, waving your arms to the Confederates and saying, look, we're up to something here along the river. And what's the second lieutenant going to do having a lieutenant colonel under his orders? But Jones makes the best of it. He tells Branson, will bring your troops into the chaparral and follow along behind my two companies, and we'll try and outflank the Confederates. And despite this addition of force and the attention that it should have drawn from the Confederates, Jones is able to get into place to launch his attack. Just as he's assembling his troops, one of the colored soldiers accidentally fires his musket, which of course draws the attention of Captain Robinson's Confederate cavalry, which uses its superior mobility to escape the trap. The Federals under Jones and Branson come out of the chaparral and they chase after the Confederates, but of course they're not going to catch them. They get up on some high ground and they fire a volley, but the Confederates are long gone, and it's here that Jones and Branson stop. Colonel Barrett comes riding up. He's got Colonel Morrison with him. He comes up to Jones, and once again, he congratulates them for doing a good job. It almost worked. Too bad the rebels got away. And he asks the question again, well, Lieutenant, what do you think we should do? And this time, Jones is not going to play the game. He's like, whatever you say, sir, but it's pretty obvious that men on foot are not going to catch men on horses. And so Barrett says, well, what do you suggest? And he says, well, sir, if we're not going to try and chase the Confederate cavalry, perhaps we should go back to Palmetto Hill and have lunch. And Barrett says, that's a capital idea, Lieutenant. That's exactly what we're going to do. So once again, he ignores the colonels with him, and he orders everyone back to Palmetto Hill, which again is only about 15 feet high above the surrounding plain. The Federals march back there, they stack arms, and they commence eating their lunch. No skirmishers are put out, no pickets are put out, and the Federals are here basically taking their ease while Barrett's trying to figure out what to do. And he's actually contemplating marching overland toward Point Isabel, or at least he claims later that he was, which would make no sense whatsoever because there's no water along that route. It's a long, difficult march. If he got to Point Isabel, how would he get back to Plaza Santiago? Remember, the steamer that you tried to use 2 days before had broken down. Has it been repaired? How would he communicate with his forces on the island? It doesn't really make any sense, but not much of what Barrett is doing is making any sense on May 13th of 1865. But while the Federals are taking their ease here, Rip Ford's Confederate cavalry and that battery of artillery are marching from Fort Brown toward Palmetto Ranch. And although Robinson has sent back a courier saying, hey, look, the Federals are pressing me, they've been reinforced, Ford refuses to gallop to the battlefield. He's not going to get there with worn out horses. He's going to take his time. And when he arrives, the Federals have pulled back to Palmetto Hill, and the fighting for the moment seems to be over. From Ford's perspective, this is what the battlefield now looks like. The horizon is the Rio Grande River, and right there, that's Palmetto Hills. You can see it's not much of an elevation, but on that flat ground, it's at least something that ought to give the Federals at least an advantage for observation. But that's a lot of flat ground the Confederate cavalry would have to pass over. And if the Federal infantry is alert and ready to fight, the Confederates, of course, are in trouble because infantry is supposed to be superior to cavalry on the battlefield. The Federals outnumber Ford by about 100 men, although Ford does have artillery, which the Federals do not have. And Ford's not really sure about what he should do. And he writes later in his memoir that from the number of Federals that he saw in front of him, if he started a battle, he was likely to lose it. And did he really want to lose a battle this close to the end of the war, or what seemed like was probably going to be the end of the war? But as he rides amongst his troops, he finds out that they are in incredibly high spirits. They are eager to go. They are willing to fight. They start yelling, rip, rip, rip. And so Ford says, you know what? If my men are willing to fight, I am willing to lead them. So he begins to deploy his forces. And he recognizes that Barrett has actually put himself in a very bad position. He's placed his entire command at the bottom of a great loop in the Rio Grande River. And so if Ford could get some troops up to the top of that loop and cut the military road, then Barrett's whole command would be caught in a sack, cut off from reinforcement or retreat to Brazos Santiago, and the Confederates, basically putting a cork into this bottle from which the Federals would not be able to escape. So Ford sends 2 companies of cavalry, each with a section of artillery, to try and outflank the Federals while he deploys his main body behind a dense growth of chaparral on the plain. And from the Federal perspective, this is what they see. There is that growth of chaparral. And so the Confederate main body is deploying here, and it is invisible to Barrett, but his men do catch sight of the dust cloud being kicked up by Ford's flanking force. And at the last moment, Barrett realizes that he is in trouble, that there are Confederates out here, that they've been reinforced, that they're maneuvering, that the initiative has basically passed over to the enemy. And for a moment, Barrett is frozen. He is indecisive. He doesn't know what to do. He sends some companies of the 34th Indiana out onto the out onto the plain as skirmishers. But other than that, he is completely flummoxed, and it takes some minutes before his other officers, Branson and Morrison, say, "Sir, don't you think we should be getting out of here?" And at that point, Barrett says, "You're right. We should retreat. We will retreat in good order, and in good order, let it be." The 62nd Colored is the unit closest to the military road that courses around the upper bend of the river. And so it gets the order to move first, and it starts to hurry down a trail through the chaparral. And the 34th Indiana and the 2nd Texas, still up here on Palmetto Hill, seeing the colored troops move away, put the worst interpretation on that possible. These guys are running, they're leaving us in the lurch, and they're not very happy about it. They're very nervous. The 34th Indiana, of course, has been in combat. It's seen lots of fighting. It knows the potential dangers involved, and it's also quite capable of judging how well it is being led. And it doesn't have a lot of confidence in Barrett. He seems like he doesn't know what he's doing. And so there's a lot of disgruntlement here. And it is therefore with relief that the 34th Indiana finally gets orders, as does the 2nd Texas, to retreat to the top of the bend in the river as well. And so the white troops and the black troops are now booking it to try and get to the military road before the Confederates can cut them off. Fortunately for the Federals, they've got the inside arc, and the Confederates are moving with tired horses and unaware that the Federals have caught sight of them, trying to be clandestine, which of course slows their march down. And it is at this point that Rip Ford sees an opportunity, because the Federals moving off with their main body have left the skirmish line on the plain in front of Palmetto Hill, completely unsupported. And at that point, Ford says, I can't pass up on this opportunity, and he orders an attack. It is during this charge that the last battlefield fatality of the Civil War, at least the last man to be killed outright on the battlefield, falls. Private John J. Williams is struck square in the forehead by a mini bullet and killed instantly. He'd only enlisted at the end of March of 1864 at the age of 21, and he is going to be the last man killed outright in combat during the Civil War. Ford's cavalry is thundering down on the 34th Indiana. Interestingly, at this moment, a steamboat from the King and Kennedy line comes sailing down the river. The Confederate artillery takes it under fire, fearing it might be carrying Federal reinforcements. But then the wind picks up and the Mexican flag shakes out from the ship's mast, and the Confederates realize, oh, this is nothing to worry about. And they can put all their attention to gobbling up the companies of the 34th Indiana that had been left unsupported by Barrett's retreat. And that retreat, by the way, is not going well. The 34th Indiana and the 62nd are taking converging paths through the chaparral. They intersect with one another, and the 62nd is halfway through the intersection when the 34th Indiana comes up. And what the 34th Indiana, of course, should do is to stop and let the 62nd through. But the 34th Indiana says, no, we're not going to stop for anybody. And they blow right through the 62nd colored, breaking its column in half and not looking like a very confident regiment at all. After the capture of the skirmish companies, the Confederates now are in real potential danger. And so Barrett rides back to the 34th Indiana's tail. He finds Second Lieutenant Jones, who's in command of the rearmost company in the column, and he asks him to deploy a rear guard as skirmishers, and Jones refuses to do it. He says, my men are exhausted, and we fired off all of our ammunition virtually, and we're just not up to it. And Barrett once again defers to this lieutenant. He says, I understand, Lieutenant, I'm asking too much of you. Forgive me. And then he writes over to the 2nd Texas, whose two companies number just 50 men, and he tells them to deploy as a rear guard. And the commanders of these Texas Unionists tell him, we're down to 2 rounds per man, sir. We're not really equipped to be an effective rear guard. And Barrett says, it doesn't matter. We've got to have a rear guard, and we've got to have it now. So the Texans deploy, and as Ford turns his attention toward them, they fire off their last rounds, and then they break and go to hide in the chaparral along the river in hope of not being killed or captured by Ford's victorious rebels. The rest of the federal forces do manage to get up to the top of the bend in the river just barely, but they get there before the Confederates. And at this point, the 62nd Colored becomes the rear guard, and it does a really good job as the rear guard, even though it is in action for the first time. And this destroys another one of the myths of Palmetto Ranch, was that the colored troops broke and ran, leaving the white troops to hold the bag and fight their way out of potential disaster. It's actually something of the other way around. The 62nd Colored does an exceptional job, keeps the Confederates at bay as the Federals retreat back toward the Gulf of Mexico. The 34th Indiana, although it is not routed or panicked, is very anxious to get out of this potential disaster. It has no faith in Barrett whatsoever. These men do not intend to be the last ones killed in what might be the final battle of the war. They're also worn out. They're exhausted. They had marched all night. They had marched all day. Now they've fought. Several of these companies had been on a long expedition up Padre Island in the weeks right before the battle, 120 miles up and 120 miles back, and they had not recovered from that. And so the 34th Indiana is physically in very bad shape, and as it begins to retreat, it starts to throw away equipment. It's leaking stragglers, men who can't keep up. Among the men who can't keep up are the regiment's color bearers, and one of them, who has a bad foot, hands his flag to the other, who's now carrying both the U.S. and the regimental color. That is a heavy burden, and he can't keep up with it. And at a bend in the trail through dense chaparral, he falls out of ranks with both flags, and he hides the regimental color in the chaparral. He wraps the U.S. flag around him, tries to swim across the Rio Grande, but Mexicans on the far bank shoot at him, and he's forced to turn around and swim back, and then attempt to hide in the chaparral in hopes that he won't be caught by the Confederates and captured. The Federals continue a fighting retreat back toward the Gulf of Mexico. And as they get close to Boca Chica Pass, they finally get on the other side of a tidal slough, which is sort of like a moat that the Confederates cannot cross. And it is here that some gunboats in the Gulf of Mexico begin to fire inland at the Confederates. And right at dusk, a shell bursting from one of the cannon on a gunboat explodes near a young Confederate soldier, a boy who's only about 14, and out of fright, he fires his weapon and issues a string of oaths that his comrades thought were very funny coming from one so young, and that is the last land shot of the war, and the fighting comes to an end. During the night, Ford, against Slaughter's judgment, Slaughter shows up at the very end of the battle with reinforcements and is part of this last bit of the skirmish. Ford decides to retreat to Palmetto Ranch to get out of the way of any vengeful forces that might come out from Brazos Santiago to try and redeem the Federal defeat. And so the Confederates back up toward Palmetto Ranch. Barrett keeps his force in place overnight. He brings the 87th USCT out to reinforce him, but at dawn, the Confederates are gone. And at that point, the Federals march back to Brazos Island, colors flying, at least for the colored regiments, because overnight, the 34th Indiana had gone on to Brazos Island, crossed Boca Chica Pass, and returned to Brazos Santiago, which of course it makes Barrett very, very unhappy that they had continued the retreat, although he had not told them to stop and to turn and make a stand. The 62nd was the rear guard, not the 34th, but this is going to set up the last chapter of the story of Palmetto Ranch. So the fighting was over. 2 Federals had been killed outright, no Confederates. About 7 Federals had been wounded. 5 or 6 Confederates wounded, one of them mortally. But the real damage to the Federals was 104 prisoners, 25 from the 2nd Texas Cavalry, 2 from the USCT, and 77 from the 34th Indiana. As the Confederates swept over the battlefield the next day, they captured both the flags of the 34th Indiana. There is, of course, another part of this myth that the captured Texas Unionists were executed, and so were black soldiers. None of that's true. The Confederates gathered up their prisoners and they took them back to Brownsville, where they fed them and treated them decently. The next day, federal representatives from the 34th Indiana were allowed to come into Brownsville. They were given permission from Barrett to try and go and secure the release of the POWs. And the Confederates, of course, who did not have food to feed the Federals, were more than happy to let them go, although they made them sign paroles promising not to fight again until they were exchanged. And so the prisoners were not prisoners for very, very long. The 34th Indiana also sent representatives a day or two later to Rip Ford, asking if he might be willing to give them back their colors. And Ford was willing to give them back their United States flag, but he kept their regimental color as a souvenir of his victory. And so with that humiliation, the fighting at Palmetto Ranch is over, but the story of Palmetto Ranch is not, because Colonel Barrett had to blame somebody for what had happened. He was certainly not going to blame himself, and so he focused on Lieutenant Colonel Morrison of the 34th Indiana, who had lost so many prisoners, who had lost his colors, who had kept retreating until he was safe at Brazos Santiago. And so he ordered Morrison cashiered from the service. He told him to go to New Orleans and then go home, because he was being kicked out of the army. And so Morrison goes to New Orleans. He reports to the new federal commander there, which is Philip Sheridan, who's gathering together a massive invasion force to head into Texas. And Sheridan, who knows a lot about the way Army politics works, tells Morrison, he says, "No, you're not being cashiered. If Colonel Barrett has charges to prefer against you, he needs to prefer them. And then there'll be a court martial, and the court martial will decide whether you are going to be acquitted or convicted and cashiered." So Morrison goes back to Brazos Santiago. And by this point, of course, the war has come to an end. Just a few days after Palmetto Ranch, Rip Ford recognizes that the Confederates in the Trans-Mississippi have no hope of winning this war, and he orders his men to disband and go home. The Confederate governors of the Trans-Mississippi have sent instructions to Kirby Smith to disband his armies and to give up the cause. On June 2nd of 1865, there's a paper surrender by Kirby Smith to the Federals, but there's no surrender ceremony. There's no Appomattox kind of stacking of arms and folding of colors. The Texas troops merely went home. They did not surrender because they didn't believe they had been beaten. The Federals had tried over and over and over again to get in Texas, and every time they tried, they had been kicked out of the Lone Star State. Why should they go through the humiliation of a surrender when they had personally not been defeated? Nonetheless, the Battle of Palmetto Ranch, Confederate victory, though it may have been, has changed the course of events not at all. A massive federal invasion, 50,000 troops, is sweeping into Texas, and this is to stare down the French, of course, who don't want anything to do with fighting the United States. They're going to back away from the Rio Grande very, very quickly. But there are more than enough officers around now for Colonel Morrison to be court-martialed. And so very soon after the battle, a court-martial convenes in Brownsville, almost on the battlefield itself. And from July 21st to August 28th, this court-martial meets. There's 1 week of recess because one of the attorneys is ill. But during this court-martial, Morrison is brought up on charges of disobedience of order, neglect of duty for abandoning his colors, conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline. And it's a fascinating court-martial. And it's very important because it produces 250 handwritten pages of testimony. And this is the Rosetta Stone of the Battle of Palmetto Ranch, because in this court-martial, almost everybody who took part in the battle is called to testify. So Lieutenant Jones testifies, the color bearers who had dropped out of ranks carrying the 34th Indiana's flag testify, Branson testifies, Morrison testifies, Barrett testifies, and Rip Ford testifies. He'd gone to Matamoros and to escape any punishment that might be inflicted on former rebels, but he's asked to come over and testify at the court-martial, and he agrees to do that. And the defense attorney for Colonel Morrison, who's asked him to take part, gets him on his stand and says, "Tell us, how many men did you have?" And he says, "Well, I had 400 men and a battery of artillery." And the defense attorney says, "Were they cavalry, infantry, a mix?" And Ford says, "No, I just had cavalry." And he says, "Well, then in military science, which arm of the service is supposed to be superior, infantry or cavalry?" And Rip Ford says, "Well, everybody knows infantry is superior to cavalry on the battlefield." And then he asks the question, "Well, in terms of the skirmishers that were put out in front of Palmetto Hill, Morrison says that when Barrett ordered them out, Barrett was supposed to control them. They were no longer Morrison's command, and therefore the charge by Barrett that Morrison had abandoned his skirmishers to be gobbled up by the Confederates is not valid. What do you think?" And Ford says, "Well, if a brigade commander," which in essence is what Barrett had been, "orders out skirmishers, then he's in command of those skirmishers so he can cover his brigade." And so Ford plays a role in undermining the case against Morrison, who is acquitted on all charges. And so the person that Barrett wanted to blame for the Battle of Palmetto Ranch defeat is not going to get the blame. Oddly enough, Barrett isn't going to get the blame either. Everybody was sort of willing to sweep this under the rug. Nobody wanted to talk about losing the last battle of the victorious war. The 34th Indiana goes home. Some months later, the 62nd Colored is discharged. Barrett was very proud of his troops. He had been a big believer in trying to take freedmen and teach them to read and to write, and he'd done a lot of that kind of work with his regiment. He'd also worked very hard to make them worthy citizens. And there seems to be some indication that one of the reasons he was willing to fight at Palmetto Ranch is to give them the honors of combat, to show that they had fought like free men for their country and for their own personal freedom in a way. And Barrett is breveted to brigadier general for his service. So the defeat at Palmetto Ranch and the ugliness of the Morrison court-martial seems not to have hurt his career at all. Of course, there were recriminations that flowed from this, at least on the federal side. The Confederates, the Texans, are always going to be very proud of having won this last battle of the Civil War, and they're going to brag about it until the end of their days. The 34th Indiana and the 62nd Colored veterans are going to argue with each other back and forth about who was really responsible, although everybody is going to agree that Barrett really didn't have much military talent to speak of, but at least they had survived. They had survived the war. There was an accusation amongst the men of the 34th that the real reason that Barrett had brought all this on was to gain some notoriety as the conqueror of Brownsville for a post-war military career. There seems to be no merit to that charge. Barrett was a railroad engineer. He went back to doing that after the war was over. He never pursued a political career of any kind, but he did help to found something called the Lincoln Institute. And this makes perfect sense because he was an abolitionist. He was a believer in emancipation. That's why he'd taken command of a regiment of colored troops. That's why he'd worked so hard to teach his men to read and write while they were in service. This is why he tried to instill in them the sense of being good citizens and honorable veterans. And the Lincoln Institute, which is now Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri, founded by veterans of the 62nd and 65th USCT in 1866, and Barrett was a big mover and shaker of making this happen. It's really his memorial. And there's this great statue in front of the university's main building where a line of colored troops is marching toward a pedestal. And then as they climb the pedestal, they shed their gear, and then they're standing there with their diplomas as free men and honorable veterans, with Barrett standing behind them with his hands on his shoulder. This is the real monument to Colonel Barrett, if you will, and probably the better explanation of what he was, at least in the back of his mind, trying to do at Palmetto Ranch than anything else. The final story in the Palmetto Ranch saga comes long after the war, however, in 1892. By 1892, the men who had fought in the war between the states were elderly, and the rancor that had led them to the battlefield has long since subsided. They've begun to hold reunions where they can get together with old comrades and relive past events and tell stories. The great work to reconcile North and South has proceeded apace, so that by the time you're in the late 1880s and 1890s, some of these reunions are national in character, and they're bringing together former Federals and former Confederates to reminisce about the war. And you would almost get the idea that these guys had all been on the same side instead of fighting each other in vicious combat for 4 long years. And in 1892, one of the veterans of the Battle of Palmetto Ranch, one of Rip Ford's troopers, a fellow named Lee Ewing, traveled to Indianapolis, Indiana for a reunion being hosted by something called the National Alliance. This was bringing Union and Confederate veterans together. And while he was there at the reunion, he was in the dining hall, and he was eating, and he was listening over hearing some Union veterans behind him talking about their wartime experiences. And one of the Union veterans was telling his friends that he would always have a soft spot in his heart for the rebels. He had been one of the soldiers in the 34th Indiana who was wounded during the last battle of the Civil War at Palmetto Ranch, and he had fallen in very tall grass and was despairing of being found. He was afraid he was going to lay out there and die when suddenly a Confederate cavalryman rode up upon him, picked him up, put him on his horse, took him back to Brownsville, where the man received the medical attention that saved his life. And for that reason, he would always have this soft spot in his heart for the former rebels. And Lee Ewing couldn't believe what he had just heard because back in 1865, he had been the Confederate cavalryman who found that Federal soldier abandoned in the tall weeds and had taken him back to Brownsville so that a doctor could save his life. And Ewing himself, now a physician, turned around and told the Federal soldier, I was the guy. I was the guy who saved you. And after the two men sort of, confirmed each other's story, they embraced one another for a very, very long time in joy of having survived the great and tragic war between the states. And perhaps in that moment of joy and reconciliation, not only did the story of the Battle of Palmetto Ranch find a fitting end, but the story of the entire war between the states found a fitting end as well.